When dawn emerged, just hours after headlines questioned what was happening behind closed doors, Harry and Meghan stepped into public view together, and for a moment, the cameras captured something no statement could explain. Side by side, composed but carefully measured, their appearance ignited a different question entirely. Was this unity, strategy, or something more complicated beneath the surface? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For days, the conversation had already been moving in one direction. Commentators, entertainment panels, online forums, and endless speculation cycles had been trying to decode every schedule change, every solo appearance, every silence that followed. Reports and public discussion had raised questions about distance, about priorities, about whether separate projects and separate public rhythms reflected something deeper. Nothing had been confirmed. Nothing had been stated directly. Yet in the strange world that surrounds modern royal narratives, certainty has never been required for speculation to become momentum. Then came the appearance. No dramatic announcement. No carefully worded denial. No attempt to confront headlines directly. Instead, something quieter happened, and perhaps because of that, something more powerful. Harry and Meghan appeared together. At first glance it looked ordinary, familiar even. But ordinary moments become extraordinary when they arrive under extraordinary circumstances. Because this was not taking place in a vacuum. Every movement, every interaction, every brief exchange immediately became part of a larger public debate that had already been building for weeks. And almost instantly, interpretations split into competing camps. One side saw reassurance. To them, this was simply a couple continuing with public commitments while refusing to engage with speculation. They argued that not every absence signals conflict, not every in-depth appearance reveals distance, and not every headline deserves a response. In that reading, standing side by side was not a statement at all. It was normalcy. But another interpretation emerged just as quickly. Others argued that timing matters. That public appearances, especially involving figures who understand media attention better than almost anyone, rarely exist without awareness of what surrounds them. To those observers, appearing together at precisely the moment public conversations intensified felt deliberate, not defensive, not reactive, but intentional. And suddenly the discussion shifted. People stopped asking whether rumors were true and began asking something else entirely. Why appear now? That question transformed the entire conversation. Online reactions accelerated. Some pointed to posture, pauses, interactions, searching for signals hidden beneath surface appearances. Others dismissed those readings entirely, warning against turning seconds into conclusions. The I became less about what happened and more about what people believed they were witnessing. Because public life creates an impossible contradiction. Show too much, and every detail becomes evidence. Show too little, and silence becomes its own story. For Harry and Meghan, this contradiction has followed nearly every chapter of their post-royal journey. Independence brought visibility. Visibility brought interpretation. Interpretation brought narratives that often move faster than reality itself. And perhaps that was what made this appearance feel different. Not because it answered anything, but because it reminded everyone that appearances can interrupt a narrative without ending it. The headlines did not disappear. The questions did not stop. If anything, the appearance created an entirely new layer of interpretation, one less focused on absence and more focused on intention. Because inside royal-adjacent circles, symbolism has always mattered. Presence matters. Timing matters. What unshown matters just as much as what remains unsaid. And as observers looked closer, many realized this moment may not have started on the day Harry and Meghan appeared together at all. It may have started weeks earlier. But appearances inside royal-adjacent circles have rarely been accidental, and observers quickly began revisiting the weeks that led to this moment. Long before the public appearance, whispers had already started circulating, quiet observations, missing appearances, changing schedules, and the kind of speculation that grows fastest when nobody addresses it directly. What made this different was not the existence of rumors. Public figures live inside rumors. Royal-adjacent figures live inside them even more intensely. What changed was the rhythm. People who follow every appearance, every announcement, every public commitment began noticing what they believed were subtle shifts, not dramatic enough to become news on their own, but enough to become conversation. At first, information seemed disconnected. One appearance drew attention because it happened alone, another because it did not happen at all. Then came separate public focuses, different timelines, different priorities being discussed publicly. None of it confirmed anything. None of it pointed clearly in one direction. Yet speculation rarely grows from certainty. It grows from empty spaces. And once people begin connecting moments together, patterns start appearing whether they truly exist or not. Commentators started assembling timelines. Public schedules were revisited. Previous appearances were compared. Discussions emerged around whether recent months represented ordinary independence or unusual distance. Some voices dismissed the entire conversation as another familiar cycle of celebrity scrutiny. Others argued that public relationships, especially those examined for years under global attention, operate differently because absence itself becomes interpreted as communication. That was what harassed ere the narrative quietly changed, because the discussion stopped being about what had happened and became centered on what had not happened. No public statement appeared to address the growing conversation directly. No dramatic clarification interrupted the speculation. And in the absence of certainty, the internet did what it always does: it filled silence with theories. Online discussions accelerated with remarkable speed. Short clips were revisited. Older interviews resurfaced. Headlines became more speculative. Observations turned into conclusions. Conclusions turned into narratives. Before long, people were no longer discussing isolated moments but constructing larger stories about what those moments supposedly meant. Yet hidden inside all of that noise was a more uncomfortable truth. This reaction did not appear overnight. Interest in Harry and Meghan has never operated like ordinary celebrity attention. Their story has always existed inside larger themes: expectation, departure, royalty, freedom, identity. Every public move becomes symbolic because audiences rarely see them as individuals making isolated decisions. Instead, people attach larger meaning to every appearance and every absence. That history matters, because once a relationship becomes part of a public narrative, people stop watching what is happening and start watching for confirmation of what they already believe. Supporters interpreted independence as strength. Critics interpreted the same independence as separation. Neutral observers tried to separate confirmed events from assumption and discovered how difficult that had become. And as days passed, another question emerged, one that gave fresh energy to the speculation. Why now? Why had the conversation intensified during this particular period and not during earlier moments that looked similar on the surface? Some believed the answer was timing. Others believed it was cumulative attention finally reaching a breaking point. But incredible. When Princess Anne emerged, easingly, people began realizing that this moment was carrying something larger than simple curiosity, because the public reaction was becoming less about schedules, less about appearances, and less about whether rumors were true. It was becoming a reflection of something built over years. Yet the public reaction wasn't really about one appearance, it reflected years of accumulated expectations. For Harry and Meghan, every appearance now carries more than personal meaning. It carries the weight of decisions that changed institutions, identities, and expectations. That may be the most unusual consequence of their story, not that people continue to watch, but that every public moment now feels connected to choices made years earlier. Because once a public figure steps outside a role as visible and symbolic as royal life, the audience rarely allows that story to become ordinary again. What began as a decision to reshape a future gradually became something larger. A reinvention observed in Rye. Now, time. New projects emerged. New partnerships appeared. Different causes, different audiences, different priorities. Piece by piece, a public identity formed outside the framework people once associated with them. To supporters, it represented autonomy and the courage to define life on different terms. To critics, it raised questions about whether true distance from old institutions is ever possible when the legacy of those institutions still follows every headline. And somewhere between those two interpretations, a more difficult reality took shape. Reinvention sounds powerful in theory. In practice, it creates expectations. Every appearance becomes proof of success or evidence of struggle. Every announcement becomes symbolic. Every absence becomes interpreted. And over time, the space to simply exist becomes smaller. That pressure does not arrive all at once. It builds quietly. One interview becomes a turning point. One public decision becomes a reference point. One period of silence. A SAN emerged, CE becomes analyzed more intensely than months of activity. Eventually, people stop reacting to the present and begin measuring every new moment against the story they already believe they understand. That may explain why recent conversations felt unusually intense. Because people were not only reacting to what Harry and Meghan were doing now, they were reacting to what those actions represented. Public fascination with transformation has always contained a contradiction. People celebrate change until change becomes difficult to interpret. Audiences admire independence but often remain attached to the identity someone left behind. And nowhere does that contradiction become more visible than in relationships. Public couples are expected to perform impossible balances. Be united, but not calculated. Be independent, but not distant. Be visible, but not overexposed. Reveal enough to feel authentic, but never enough to lose mystery. The rules shift constantly, and the consequences have fallen. Outside those expectations can reshape the entire conversation overnight. That is why controlling narratives becomes so difficult. Because narratives are rarely controlled by statements alone. They are shaped by timing, by memory, by expectations, by the stories people continue telling themselves long after circumstances evolve. For Harry and Meghan, that means every appearance enters a conversation already in progress. People do not simply ask what happened, they ask what it means. They compare, they revisit, they reinterpret, and slowly ordinary moments begin carrying extraordinary weight. Not because those moments necessarily contain hidden meaning, but because millions of people arrive prepared to find it. That may be why one appearance suddenly felt larger than it should have, not because it revealed something new, but because it collided with years of expectations, years of reinvention, years of public debate about identity, distance, and belonging. And perhaps that's why even ordinary moments become loaded with meaning. A glance, a pause, a few seconds of footage, and suddenly millions of viewers believe they saw a hidden story unfolding. That is the strange power of public life in the modern era. Moments that would once disappear into ordinary memory now become evidence. A brief interaction becomes a theory. A familiar expression becomes analysis. A silence becomes interpretation. And when the people involved carry years of history, symbolism, and public fascination, even the smallest fragment can begin to feel larger than reality itself. That was exactly what happened next. The appearance itself lasted only moments in public conversation before attention shifted somewhere else entirely, not to what was said, but to what people believed they noticed. Social media moved first. Clips began circulating. Short observations turned into long threads. Comment sections filled with certainty built from seconds. One person interpreted calm as reassurance. Another translated the same calm as distance. Someone else pointed to timing, expression, posture, rhythm. Before long, thousands of people were discussing details that had never been intended as statements in the first place. And perhaps that was the most revealing part of all. People were not watching for information. They were watching for confirmation. Because once audiences become emotionally invested in a narrative, they rarely arrive with empty expectations. They arrive carrying theories, preferences, assumptions, disappointments, and hopes, and every public moment becomes filtered through them. That is why body language commentary has become such a powerful force. It promises access to something hidden. It suggests that beneath public appearances lies a deeper truth waiting to be decoded. That a glance reveals conflict. That distance reveals emotion. That timing reveals strategy. But reality is rarely that clean. Observation and certainty are not the same thing. Noticing something is not, and understanding it. Yet ambiguity creates a vacuum, and vacuums rarely stay empty. This is where modern public storytelling becomes almost impossible to escape. A moment appears. People react. Media notices the reaction. Coverage expands. The reaction becomes the story. Then the story creates new reactions. And suddenly, what began as a few seconds of public attention becomes a much larger cultural conversation. Not because new facts appeared, but because interpretation multiplied. That cycle feels especially powerful around figures whose lives already exist between celebrity and symbolism. Because audiences rarely believe they are simply watching people. They believe they are watching signals. Every interaction becomes meaningful. Every pause becomes intentional. Every ordinary moment becomes transformed into narrative. And the more ambiguous the moment, the stronger the engagement becomes. Certainty ends conversations. Ambiguity keeps them alive. That may explain why this appearance Meghan merited so much attention despite revealing so little directly. There was no dramatic statement, no confirmation, no confrontation, only enough uncertainty to invite interpretation. Some people walked away believing they had witnessed unity. Others became more convinced something remained unresolved. Many likely saw exactly what they expected to see before the appearance even happened, and perhaps that realization says more than the footage itself. Because sometimes public fascination reveals less about the people being watched and more about the expectations of the people watching. Yet even with all that uncertainty, one thing remained difficult to ignore. Moments become stories. Stories become narratives. And narratives rarely emerge by accident. Still, public appearances are rarely random and timing matters. If timing shapes perception, then this appearance arrived at exactly the moment people were most ready to interpret it. That may be what separated this moment from countless others that came before it. Public attention does not move in straight lines. It gathers slowly, often unnoticed at first, until one event becomes the point where everything suddenly feels connected. A single appearance, a familiar gesture, a shared moment. Not because that moment necessarily contains new information, but because audiences have already spent days, sometimes weeks, preparing themselves to assign meaning to whatever comes next. And for people who live under extraordinary public attention, timing becomes its own language. That does not mean every appearance is strategic, but it does mean appearances rarely happen in isolation. High-profile public figures understand something most people never have to think about. Attention does not disappear simply because nobody speaks. Silence communicates. Presence communicates. Distance communicates. The challenge is that once public interest reaches a certain level, even refusing to respond becomes interpreted as a response. That creates an impossible balancing act. Address speculation too directly, and the conversation grows. Ignore it completely, and interpretation expands to fill the silence. Appear publicly, and people search for hidden messages. Stay private, and absence becomes the headline. So the question surrounding this moment was never only whether Harry and Meghan appeared together. It became why this appearance happened when it did. And suddenly another layer entered the conversation. People began asking whether visibility itself had become the message. Not a denial, not confirmation, simply presence. History has shown this pattern before, not only around royal figures but around public life in general. Moments of renewed visibility often become symbolic because audiences want resolution. They want a single image, a single event, a single appearance that explains everything they have been discussing. But reality rarely offers that kind of clean ending. Public resets do not always arrive through announcements. Sometimes they arrive through rhythm, a reappearance, a continuation, a reminder that life keeps moving even while conversations continue around it. And yet that strategy comes with its own risks. Because when attention is already heightened, people do not interpret visibility neutrally. Supporters see confidence. Skeptics see calculation. Others see uncertainty being managed. Everyone watches the same moment and leaves with a different conclusion. That may explain why this appearance felt unusually powerful despite offering so few direct answers. It interrupted momentum without replacing it. It slowed one conversation while creating another. Instead of ending speculation, it changed its shape. People stopped asking whether distance existed and started asking whether appearances themselves had become part of the conversation. Because perhaps the most difficult truth about public life is this: you do not always control the story by speaking. Sometimes you influence it simply by deciding when to appear and when not to. And once audiences become invested enough, meaning begins forming whether you intended it or not. That is where perception becomes unpredictable. Because eventually the focus shifts away from public strategy altogether. Eventually people stop asking what was shown. They start asking what remains unsaid. But beyond headlines, another question emerged. Behind every public image exists a private reality the audience never fully sees and perhaps never should. That may be the hardest truth to accept in stories like this. Public life creates an illusion of access. Appearances become familiar. Interviews create proximity. Headlines create continuity. Over time, audiences begin to feel as though they know people they have never actually met. Not because they are careless or unreasonable, but because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity can quietly become certainty. But familiarity is not the same thing as understanding. And nowhere does that become AI more complicated than in relationships. Because relationships are built in private but interpreted in public, every couple experiences moments nobody else understands. Seasons of closeness, seasons of change, different priorities, different pressures, private conversations that never become headlines. Yet once a relationship becomes part of public identity, ordinary human experiences begin carrying extraordinary expectations. That may explain why conversations surrounding Harry and Meghan rarely stay simple. People are not only reacting to two individuals, they are reacting to what those individuals represent. For some, their story became a symbol of independence. For others, it became a symbol of separation. For many, it became a reflection of larger questions about tradition, identity, public pressure, and the cost of redefining a life under permanent attention. And because of that, uncertainty becomes uncomfortable. People want answers. They want confirmation. They want moments through, and everything at once. But life rarely works that way. Public narratives create neat arcs. Real lives rarely do. That contrast can become emotionally exhausting not only for audiences trying to understand, but for the people living inside the attention itself, because visibility has a cost. Every silence invites interpretation. Every appearance creates expectations. Every decision becomes symbolic. And eventually, even ordinary experiences begin feeling impossible to separate from public meaning. That is why speculation persists. Not necessarily because people want conflict. Sometimes people simply want clarity. They search for signs because uncertainty feels unfinished. They revisit moments because stories without endings are difficult to let go of. But there is another possibility that often receives less attention. Sometimes uncertainty exists because uncertainty is the truth. Sometimes public moments are simply public moments. Sometimes private realities remain private not, and because something dramatic is hidden, but because human lives cannot be fully understood through headlines, appearances, or carefully interpreted fragments. That idea can feel unsatisfying. It offers no final answer, no revelation, no dramatic confirmation, only the reminder that public visibility has limits. And perhaps those limits matter more than people realize. Because once audiences begin believing every pause contains a secret and every appearance contains a message, something important disappears. Curiosity becomes expectation. Observation becomes ownership. And people stop allowing room for uncertainty altogether. That may be why this moment became so emotionally charged. Not because everyone agreed on what it meant, but because everyone arrived carrying different hopes, different assumptions, and different conclusions. Some saw reassurance. Some saw performance. Some saw nothing unusual at all. And perhaps all of those reactions reveal something equally important. The audience are only reacting to one appearance. They were reacting to everything they believed that appearance represented. And that tension may explain why reactions became so divided. The appearance lasted minutes. The debate lasted much longer. That may be the clearest sign that this moment had already become bigger than the event itself. Because public attention rarely ends when an appearance ends. In stories shaped by years of scrutiny, identity, and expectation, the appearance is often only the beginning. What follows becomes its own second act: analysis, reaction, interpretation, and eventually, something even more powerful: collective storytelling. And that process began almost immediately. Commentary emerged in waves. First came the immediate responses. The people convinced the appearance spoke for itself. To them, the message seemed obvious. They saw familiarity, stability, continuity. They argued that the public conversation had grown larger than reality and that appearing together, IR, was enough to answer questions without saying a word. Then came a different interpretation. Others looked at the same moment and reached the opposite conclusion. They questioned timing. They questioned intention. They wondered whether public unity and private reality could ever be assumed to mean the same thing. To them, the appearance did not settle anything, it introduced new questions. What made the reaction remarkable was not disagreement. Disagreement was expected. What stood out was how confidently people interpreted the same moment in completely different ways. Because by that point, audiences were no longer reacting only to what happened. They were reacting to years of context. Online communities fractured into familiar patterns. Supportive voices emphasized resilience, arguing that public pressure had created impossible expectations, That appearing together became an act of refusing to let outside narratives define the story. Skeptical voices viewed the attention itself as meaningful, suggesting that when public curiosity reaches this level, appearances inevitably become part of the conversation rather than separate from it. Others express something entirely different: fatigue, not disagreement, fatigue. Questions emerged about why public fascination remains so intense, why certain stories return again and again, why audiences continue searching for definitive answers inside moments that rarely provide them. But even that fatigue carried a contradiction, because while some people claimed exhaustion with the conversation, they still watched, they still reacted, they still interpreted. That may reveal something deeper about stories like this. Public interest does not survive simply because people care about outcomes. It survives because people care about meaning. People want stories to move forward. They want clarity. They want turning points. And when those turning points never fully arrive, attention often becomes even more intense. That is how narrative cycles renew themselves. A moment appears, interpretation divides, attention increases, then the conversation begins again, and slowly, people stop discussing what happened and begin discussing what everyone else believes happened. That may be why reactions felt unusually emotional this time. Not because there was dramatic new information, but because audiences had invested emotionally in different versions of the story. Some believed they saw reassurance. Some believed they saw performance. Some believed they saw absolutely nothing unusual. And perhaps none of those interpretations fully explain why the moment lasted. Because what kept the conversation alive was not certainty. It was possibility. The possibility that something had changed. The possibility that nothing had changed. The possibility that audiences were searching for answers in places where answers were never meant to exist. And as the debate continued, one realization quietly remained at the center of everything. The appearance had ended. The meaning had not. In the end, the lasting image wasn't certainty, it was ambiguity. They appeared together. The cameras moved on. But the questions remained exactly where they were before. And perhaps that was always going to be the outcome. Because by the time this moment arrived, the conversation had already become larger than any single appearance could resolve. For all the attention surrounding public figures, there is a quiet contradiction at the center of it all. People often hope appearances will provide certainty, when appearances were never designed to carry that weight. A shared moment can suggest presence. It cannot explain private conversations. A public appearance can interrupt speculation. It cannot settle emotion. And standing beside someone in public does not automatically answer the questions people have already decided to ask. Yet people continue searching, not because they are unreasonable, but because stories invite conclusions. Audiences narrowly look for turning points. They search for signs that explain what changed, what remained, and what comes next. They want a moment that suddenly makes everything clear. But life, especially public life, rarely unfolds with that kind of neat resolution. That may be part of what has kept fascination surrounding Harry and Meghan so persistent over the years. Their story has never existed only as a series of appearances or headlines. It became something broader. To different audiences, it came to represent different ideas entirely: change and tradition, freedom and expectation, reinvention and continuity. And when stories begin carrying that much meaning, people stop observing moments as they are. They begin asking what those moments symbolize. That is why showing up together felt significant to so many people. Not because it confirmed something, not because it disproved something, but because presence itself became interpreted as communication, a reminder, a pause, a continuation, a sale to let public conversation decide what comes next. And still, even with all the analysis, all the commentary, all the competing interpretations, one reality remained untouched. Nobody watching could truly know what existed beyond the moment itself. That uncertainty can feel unsatisfying, but uncertainty is not failure. Sometimes uncertainty is simply honesty. Because not every silence hides a secret, not every appearance carries a message, and not every unanswered question requires an answer. There is something strangely revealing about that. After all the headlines, after the speculation, after the debates over timing and meaning and intention, what remains is not a definitive conclusion. Only a moment, two people appearing together, an audience trying to understand, and a reminder that public narratives often reveal as much about the audience as they do about the people being watched. Perhaps that is why moments like this stay with people, not because they solve anything, but born, masse, because they leave enough space for people to bring their own hopes, concerns, beliefs, and expectations into the story. Some people will see reassurance, others will see strategy. Some will decide nothing unusual happened at all, and all of those interpretations will continue existing side by side because public stories rarely end with certainty. They fade, they evolve, they return, and eventually another moment arrives and the conversation begins again. Sometimes the most powerful public message isn't what people reveal, it's what they choose to leave unexplained. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.